Let me get my timer going. I had my phone up here with my timer on another talk and said something that sounded like, "Hey Siri," and Siri started talking to me, and that was odd. In any case, I'm Tricia Phillips, and on behalf of my colleagues, one of whom is here today, Elizabeth Heitman, I am very pleased to be here presenting the results of our study, which is looking at the impact of America Competes at 5 years, and it's now been 7 years since it was implemented, but it was 5 years when we collected the data for this, so forgive me for that 2-year time lag. A little bit of background. In the US, the biggest driver for education and the responsible conduct of research is the federal government. And these requirements are tied to money, in particular, certain types of federal grants for research training and projects. Individual institutions, schools, and individual programs within schools do sometimes have research ethics education requirements, but the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the NSF, the National Science Foundation, are by far the widest in scope. The NIH policy on RCR training is 25 years old, and it requires RCR training for the recipients of certain awards. This policy has gone through several revisions, most recently in 2009, when the new guidelines incorporated best practices for format, scope, content, duration, and frequency. And so the current NIH guidelines require, they specifically state that online instruction is not sufficient, so they require some face-to-face instruction. They require instruction on a comprehensive set of issues. They require a minimum of 8 hours, and they require a renewal or a refresher at each career stage. And these requirements are explicitly stated in the policy. In contrast, the NSF is only 7 years old, 5 years old at the time we started this study, and its policy states no criteria, but at the time that they implemented the policy, the NSF conducted a lot of outreach to inform schools about best practices. This outreach communicated that online-only training is less effective, that multiple formats are needed, that content can and should vary by discipline and career stage, and that a single dose of training is ineffective. But none of these practices are stated in the policy or identified as requirements. Rather, the policy is based on the premise that the research community is best placed to determine the content of RCR training without a need for NSF-specified standards. So this was our research question. When a government agency issues a policy requiring RCR training, but leaves the details of the plan up to the discretion of the research community, how does the research community respond? Do they respond by developing a plan in accordance with best practices? Our speculations were no, they do not. Anecdotal evidence indicated that they do not. But we wanted to take a systematic look at the plans in place, and so we wanted to construct an evidence-based picture of what's actually going on, how schools are responding. So using a sample of 108 research-intensive universities, for those of you who are familiar with the Carnegie rankings, we looked at the R1 institutions, or the institutions that are now classified as very high research activity. We gathered all of the publicly available RCR plans for these institutions through basic internet searches, and we coded for the format, structure, duration, and frequency of the RCR education that's offered and required. This is our sample characteristics. Of the 108 institutions that we looked for, we were unable to find 5 plans, right? We were unable to find the plans for 5 institutions, and that is that these plans were not publicly available. That does not mean that they do not have plans. That means only that their plans were not accessible on the public part of their website. Let's see, beyond those 5, the plans for 7 schools were so unclear that the 2 coders who were looking at the policies, which would have been myself and one of our graduate students, the 2 coders who were reading the policies could not figure out what the policies required. So 7 of them were sufficiently unclear that we could not include them in the analysis. And 5 universities did not have university-wide requirements. And I don't want to say whether this is a good or bad thing. I would like to go ahead and point out that UCSD, the University of California at San Diego, was in this category. We coded them as not having university-wide requirements. But UCSD does a phenomenal job. They've got a very impressive array of offerings for research ethics education, but when you read their America Competes plan, nothing is actually required. Right? So we coded them as not having a university-wide requirement. Michigan State is also in this category, though we did consider them exemplary, and that's because they do not have a university-wide requirement. Instead, they have 16 different plans corresponding to their different colleges and programs, right? And so they had a plan that responded to the discipline needs of their students, but they were the only ones who did that, and were so anomalous compared to the rest of the schools that we did not analyze them further. And so the rest of the schools, the 91 schools that we did analyze, gave us something like this. For these 91 schools, our speculations were, for the most part, true. They were not incorporating best practices. In fact, 75 of the 91 schools have training plans that require nothing more than non-instructor-led online training. We saw a lot of plans that looked just like this. This plan is from Emory University, and I'm going to pick on them just a little bit by throwing their plan up here, though I'll say at a later point that Emory does a great job in a lot of other things. It's just this is what their particular plan looks like. This plan requires nothing more than the city online training. It offers nothing more than online. It provides fewer than 4 hours of training. It states nothing about when it has to be completed and whether a renewal or refresher is required. And it applies to everybody, regardless of discipline and regardless of career stage. In fact, we saw some variation of this monolithic plan 30 times, which accounts for 31% of the schools. I go back and forth as to whether this is a good number. Sometimes I think the glass is half empty, and I think, my gosh, a third of the schools are clearly disregarding best practices and not doing anything more. But then I also think that sometimes the glass is half full, because roughly 2/3 of the school, there is something more going on than offering nothing more and requiring nothing more than city. And so I just want to tell you quickly about 2 of those things. We found that for at least a third of the institutions had a differentiated plan, and we categorized differentiated versus uniform as some institutions differentiate the classes of trainees, offering and requiring different formats and different minimum levels of training for undergraduates, graduates, and postdocs, whereas other plans have the same minimum RCR training requirement for all of them. And if you look at the plans for which online-only training is sufficient, you'll see that the differentiating plans are more responsive to the differing needs of the different career stages. And there is a clear trend that the requirements become more robust as students progress through their career. But that was not the case in at least one school. Penn State is at Penn State, postdocs are the only class of trainees for whom online only is sufficient. Right? So they require face-to-face for all other career stages, but not for postdocs. The second interesting thing that we found is that a number of the schools are offering more than online, even if they're not requiring it, right? And so if you look only at the uniform plans, you'll see that a number of schools are offering face-to-face supplements. They're even offering face-to-face alternatives, but they're not requiring face-to-face supplements. And in some cases, the face-to-face alternatives aren't really even alternatives, because if a student goes through that face-to-face class, they still have to complete the city module. So a number of schools have a lot of other things going on, but it's not incorporated in a coherent way into their plan. It's not required, and it's not actually an alternative. So this was the overall picture in the end. On the bright side, at least 64% of the schools are offering more than online, even if they're not requiring it for all of their students. 18% of the schools require more than online, and 6% of the schools that we studied don't even offer online as a way to satisfy the America Competes requirement. So I'm going to skip through a couple other slides to close with this, and then I think I'll be in about 10 minutes. These are sort of the landmark dates for major changes in RCR education. And the most recent one that came out, I think just in April, is the new NASEM report, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which again reiterates the importance of presenting RCR education as an integral part of research. But it also cautions against the dangers that come from doing RCR poorly. And I'm going to read you two quick quotes here. The report states, for example, when faculty members and administrators or managers express a lack of enthusiasm or even disdain for RCR training, that can have a deleterious effect. Research environments can convey this message in a number of subtle and unintended ways. And students and postdoctoral researchers may come to see RCR training as a regulatory burden or even believe that the responsible conduct of research is not important to their research or careers. Similarly, and now I'm speaking for us, not NASEM, presenting RCR as a compliance activity for federal regulations to be completed online, outside of class, without any involvement from the advisor, and applying only to trainees receiving federal funds rather than all trainees, or even all trainees on a project, could communicate the wrong message about the importance of socializing trainees in the responsible conduct of research. I skipped a number of points that are a number of our findings, but the publication related to this project is already out, and it's open access if anyone wants to know any more about our project or what we found. Thanks.
So we have time for one or two questions.
Yeah, it just occurred to me I'd like to put together Mike's talk and yours. I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I don't know if anybody else does, but since so many people emphasize city training, and I suspect many people around the world do, not just in the United States, the question is, what evidence, if any, is there that it's effective for anything? And I'll just leave it at that. Do you?
So I'll have to say that indeed I don't know the answer to that, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to revisit City, because I want to make sure that our message is clear. The authors of this study and of our report, which includes me and Liz and the two people we work with, we think City is great. Liz and I have both written for City, and a number of people in this room have written for City, and the content of City is really good stuff. City was never designed to be used as a standalone RCR educational program, right? It was never designed to be used as a one-size-fits-all, single dose of inoculation type of thing, but that is what we're finding in terms of how it is being used. And I don't know if there is, I actually don't know what evidence there is as to whether that's effective. Yeah.
Yeah, I can answer the question, Mike. Online training courses work great for experts. City training is valuable for me. It updates me in the rules. But it doesn't work for novices. And the problem is a lot of the institutions are using city training effectively for novices. So the short answer is it doesn't work for it. It works for the purpose it was designed for. It does not work for individual institutions.
Yeah, so a lot of institutions are using it exactly like this, as a monolithic training plan as a one-size-fits-all for everybody and nothing more. Yeah.
Channel Paul Braunschweiger, one of the originators, they do some update and ask questions, and many people who take the city courses, you finish the module, you answer a little survey. and they ask people whether they learn something from it. And many people, and I have no idea what the actual statistics are, but many people report that they learned something from the module. They don't have to say that. They don't even have to do the survey.
Okay.
So there is something, but as you said, giving people just the city course is like giving people a book. It doesn't work unless you talk to them about it.
Right, and indeed, our method for this project was to look at the best practices that were known and communicated at the time, whether they remain best practices, whether they are evidence-based best practices. I'm not in a position to answer that, right? But those were the best practices that were known and communicated at the time. And so we wanted to see if they were incorporated into the plans. And then I also want to say something else about Emory. Emory is another school that's doing a fantastic job at RCR education. They've got a lot of interesting things going on. They've got a really interesting portfolio of opportunities. None of those educational opportunities are incorporated into their America Competes plan. Right? In fact, if you went searching for their America Competes plan to find out what you need to do to satisfy this compliance requirement, you would never even know what else they're doing at that institution. And there's no indication that if you did one of those other opportunities, it would count as satisfying this requirement.
Okay,
Do we
go
have
ahead.
one more,
This is the last question,
Thank you.
please.
I'm Joanna Johnson. I'm from the University of Miami. I was interested in if you could speak a little bit more, and this might relate to what Mike was talking about as well, about the cost and encouraging. I mean, it seems as though there are just not that many institutions who are actually in compliance with best practices, and the cost is seen to be prohibitive by university administrators. Which organizations, or can you offer any advice as to how to encourage university administrators to take this more seriously and to redirect some costs, some resources into providing these services?
Right, so I'm not aware of any cost studies for what it costs to do a proper educational program. But a lot of us here are involved in it, and a lot of us are doing it for very little cost, sometimes out of our own hide, right? One of the things that we say in the paper is for any given institution, there's probably already a number of things going on. They just haven't done any kind of proper inventory of their RCR resources and gathered the things that they could include and incorporate into a plan, as well as how they could grow it. We'd love to do a follow-up study of best practices for designing and implementing institutional plans, but there's not many places that would fund a study like that, and these take a lot of time.
Tricia, just a quick comment and a question. In the U.S., we have here all perspectives from U.S. because we're U.S. speakers and are talking about your experience. But thinking more broadly, I think other people here from other countries and are probably thinking about implementing RCR training and and for example, what we discuss right now in Brazil is the effectiveness of having, for example, only online training at the very beginning for universities which do not have people. I mean, they are not interested or they do not feel comfortable with starting a face-to-face course. So what do you recommend for countries and institutions which do not have a tradition for RCR training? Do you think that it is worth starting by online training?
Well, the very first thing you could do, again, the city modules are valuable if used slightly differently in most cases. And so the very first thing you could do is you could continue with city and you have trainees and their advisors do a module and then meet for a face-to-face discussion afterwards. Right? Have them talk about it, have them internalize it, talk about questions, and so forth, and then just continue moving forward so you can incorporate a face-to-face element into it in a very non-threatening way, in a way that wouldn't require many resources except for people's time to participate in that. And if they're reluctant to give up their time, maybe you could offer them lunch. Okay.
Thank you, Tricia. Thanks again for the lively presentation.